I want you to picture this. It's the spring of 1945. The Second World War is finally shuddering to a close in Europe. And inside Germany, an 11-year-old boy named Helmuth is lying in bed trying to sleep. But he can't because he overhears his parents talking. And what he hears them say is going to change his life forever.
His father, a respected doctor and a dedicated Nazi, is talking about killing not just himself, but his entire family. He's absolutely terrified of what's coming, saying, "Now the Allies will do to us what we did to the Klippelden Jews." And just one day later, that's what happened. Helmuth's father went into his office and shot himself.
So you have to ask yourself, what on earth could have happened? What kind of reality, what kind of belief system could make a man so terrified of revenge that killing his own children seemed like the only logical way out? To get to the bottom of that, we really need to understand the deep, widespread desperation that took hold of an entire country and dragged it down into one of the darkest chapters in human history. And to really understand Germany in the 1940s, we've got to rewind the clock. We need to go all the way back to the end of the First World War and the birth of a brand new and very fragile democracy. So when Imperial Germany lost the war in 1918, it was a massive shock to the system. The emperor was out, and in 1919, a new democratic government, known as the Weimar Republic, came into being. But pretty much its first order of business was to sign a peace treaty that a lot of Germans saw as a complete and utter national humiliation. And I mean, the terms of this Treaty of Versailles were just brutal. Germany lost its colonies, huge parts of its own territory, its industrial heartland, and it was forced to pay these soul-crushing reparations. But maybe the real gut punch was the war guilt clause, which made Germany take the blame for the entire war. So here's the really crucial part. A lot of Germans didn't blame the old empire that actually started the war. No, they pointed the finger at the new democracy that signed the peace treaty. The people who supported it were spat on, called the November criminals, and accused of stabbing the country in the back. That resentment was there right from day one. So you've got this political powder keg ready to blow, and then you pour gasoline all over it in the form of a catastrophic economic collapse that just pushed German society to its absolute breaking point. See, to pay off those huge reparations, the government just started printing money, like tons of it. This kicked off something called hyperinflation, which is a fancy way of saying that the money in people's pockets became about as valuable as toilet paper. I mean, just look at these numbers. They're absolutely insane. In April of 1923, it took 24,000 German marks to equal $1. By December of that same year, it was almost 99 million. People were literally pushing wheelbarrows piled high with cash down the street just to buy a single loaf of bread. Your entire life savings? Poof. Gone. For a little while, things kind of stabilized, mostly thanks to American loans. But that stability was, well, it was built on sand. When the Wall Street crash hit in 1929, those American loans dried up overnight, and the German economy just got hammered harder than anywhere else on Earth. By 1932, 6 million Germans were out of work. 6 million. Let that sink in. You had men standing on street corners with signs around their necks that just said willing to do any work. This wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a crisis of faith in the whole democratic system. It felt like a total failure, and that feeling created the perfect breeding ground for radical ideas. And into this perfect storm of fear, humiliation, and desperation stepped a man named Adolf Hitler, who promised he had all the answers. And this chart just says it all, really. Before the Great Depression hit, back in 1928, the Nazi Party was this tiny fringe group. They got a measly 2.6% of the vote. But just 4 years later, in the absolute depths of the crisis, bam, they were the single largest party in Germany with 37%. It was a shocking, explosive rise. So how on earth did he pull that off? Well, Hitler was an incredibly powerful speaker, and he basically crafted a message that was tailor-made for people's fears. He promised to bring back German pride, to tear up that hated Versailles Treaty, to get people back to work, and crucially, he gave them someone to blame, promising to get rid of all these so-called foreign conspiracies. He offered easy answers to incredibly complicated problems. So, in January 1933, Hitler becomes chancellor. He'd used the democratic process to gain power, and the very first thing he did was set about systematically destroying it. And the speed at which this happened is just terrifying. We're not talking years, we're talking weeks.
Less than a month after he took office, a mysterious fire breaks out in the Parliament building. He uses that as an excuse to pass the Fire Decree, which basically suspends all civil rights. A few days after that comes the Enabling Act, which lets him rule by himself, no questions asked, and just like that, democracy in Germany was dead. With total control locked down, the regime began to put its monstrous racial ideology into practice. And this wasn't random violence. It was a chilling, cold, systematic process. It started with step 1, exclusion. Jews and other so-called undesirables were stripped of their citizenship, their rights, their businesses. Then came step 2, ghettoization. They were forced into these tiny sealed-off neighborhoods to starve. And that all led to the final horrifying goal, annihilation. Systematic, industrial-scale murder in the death camps. Which brings us right back to where we started this whole thing. Back to that little boy Helmuth and his father's absolute terror in the spring of 1945. Because while the world was at war, the Nazis were waging another, secret war, a genocidal war. The numbers, they're almost impossible to truly comprehend. 6 million Jews, 1 million Polish civilians, hundreds of thousands of Roma people, tens of thousands of disabled Germans, and an uncountable number of political opponents, all murdered. And that is the answer to our question. That is what Helmut's father was so afraid of. He wasn't afraid of what the Allies might do. He was terrified that they would do to him, to his family, what he knew his own regime had done to millions of innocent people. His fear wasn't based on some wild fantasy. It was based on his firsthand knowledge of the crimes he'd been a part of. And that really just leaves us with this one last haunting thought. It comes from Pastor Martin Niemöller, a man who resisted the Nazis and saw it all unfold. He wrote, "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out. Then they came for the Social Democrats, and I did not speak out. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." It's a timeless, powerful warning about the truly catastrophic price of looking away.